Welcome back to Convo Couch, ladies and gentlemen. I am Pasta Jardula.
And I'm Fiorella.
And Jonny Tsunami is still on those ones and twos over there.
He lives there.
He does live there. And today we have a great guest. We have a former contributing political analyst on RT, and a former lecturer, researcher at Moscow State University. And he's also a former nuclear reactor operator for the United States Navy. We have one of my favorite people on the planet. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Mark Sleboda.
Oh, Craig, thanks for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure to be on the conversation couch.
That is so like Mark Sleboda. You don't know Mark Sleboda. He would call it the conversation couch.
It
That's
sounds better
great.
that way.
It does. Can we call you Professor Mark?
You would be lying. I'm not a professor. But
Well, to me, you're one of my professors. The other day, I went into work and I was kind of walking in a tilted line, and they're like, "Pasta, man, did you go out drinking last night?" I was like, "No, I was up till 6:30 a.m. trying to get caught up on Mark Sleboda's Twitter, man." You miss one day and it takes you a week to catch up on that baby over there.
Pasta flattery will get you everywhere.
I know it will. Well, why don't you go ahead and start off with telling us your story? Because I know a lot of people are going to say tomorrow, you talked to a guy in Moscow? Why don't you tell the world, the Conversation Couch's audience, a little bit younger, hipper kind of audience, what Mark Sleboda is all about?
He's a crazy person who kind of wandered through life erratically and ended up in a place he never foresaw. Now, I'm originally from Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania, coal country. And out of high school, my parents, no one had ever gone to university before in my family, so they never saved money for my university. They were too middle class for me to get a scholarship, so I packed off and joined the Navy. I became a nuclear reactor operator. Studied in U.S. military schools, nuclear power school in Orlando and Charleston for a few years, and then spent 3 years out on a ship, USS South Carolina, before it decommissioned, sitting in an engine room, doing turns around Iraq and Serbia and so on. And then when I got out, I moved to Boston, worked for a few years in semiconductor engineering, completely boring, but more importantly, I met my wife there. She's from Crimea, Lena. We met in a goth fetish nightclub, actually, in Boston. I followed her back to Russia a year later. She was there doing her MBA at Harvard and working for Gillette at the time. Wow. And so in Moscow, I started going back to school for another higher education to study international relations. Then we moved to London for a few years, where I did my postgraduate there at the London School of Economics in international relations and security. And then we ended up back in Moscow, and I taught at Moscow State, started teaching at Moscow State University, and started doing a lot of punditry on TV. And I've been in Moscow now for over a decade total, and I officially emigrated from the U.S. to Russia, so I'm now technically a Russian citizen. That's about it. And I'm here in the south forested area of Moscow, and we've got 4 Shar-Pei and a disabled crow.
Wow.
Oh, that's amazing and stuff. So, I mean, how was it when you first moved to Moscow? Did you already speak Russian? Were you common with the language to your family growing up, or did you go there with no Russian skills whatsoever?
Yeah, my family is actually part Russian descent. That Wilkes-Barre, Scranton area of Moscow that I'm from is all Slavic immigrants. But my family, my parents don't speak a word of Russian or Slovak or any of the other Slavic ethnicities that I am comprised of. But I had just learned, I think, the Russian alphabet before I moved to Moscow, just the Cyrillic alphabet. And that was all I really had, a few words at the time. And it was huge culture shock. I mean, I come from that American, school tradition where I never properly learned a foreign language. I had some garbage Spanish in high school. But at 28, learning a foreign language, by deep drop immersion, it was a bit of a shock. I'm not going to lie and say it wasn't. It was tough. It was tougher for me to learn than nuclear physics.
Wow.
Shall we get started?
Yeah. That's it's just all I think about when I think of Moscow is how cold it is. So
it's not, though. I mean,
no?
It actually gets up into the 90s in the summer.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
See, I had no idea about that. No idea.
So you can't send you can't send us none of those Russian hats that we want to wear on the CONVO couch.
That I can absolutely send you. I can absolutely send
you. Probably get a good line on some good ones. She likes the white one, like the pearly white one, and you know what I'm saying. And yeah.
Do you want the nice fur, or do you want the vegan-friendly kitsch ones?
Yeah, the vegan-friendly one.
I want the most ethnic one. Whatever the guards are using out over there. That's what I want.
All right.
So let's get started with Syria. Thank you. Let's get started with Syria. Fam, for you, I know we're going to start with Syria, but I put up a tweet from one of your favorite people, and we're going to put it up on the screen. It was from Elizabeth Warren. I'm going to let Fiorella have at it, and you let Miss Elizabeth Warren know what was what.
Okay, so Elizabeth Warren said U.S. weapons may have ended up in the hands of al-Qaeda, linked fighters and separatist militia in Yemen, undermining our national security, oh God, and worsening the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. I'm demanding answers. And he said, seriously? For fuck's sake. No. U.S. weapons most certainly did end up in the hands of al-Qaeda itself because Obama's CIA illegally armed, trained, and salaried sectarian Islamist and jihadist militants, literally allied and embedded with al-Qaeda and ISIS for regime change in Syria. That is the correct answer. Ding, 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 ding.
Would you like to elaborate on that, Mark, and how this all got started in Syria?
I couldn't have said it better myself. So wait a minute, I didn't say that. Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely true. And this continual denial, from even what, would think are progressive Democratic voices, of course, with the exception of Tulsi Gabbard in the Democratic Party, is really disheartening. And it of course, happened under Obama's presidency, and a presidency that I actually, then volunteering for the Democratic Party, registered voters for. So in London, where I was at the time, American students and expats living in London. So it was really disheartening. And, it wasn't just in Yemen. It was in Libya and Syria and Yemen. And the Obama administration, they literally armed, trained, and salaried, head choppers and suicide bombers who were literally allied and embedded within a much larger Al-Qaeda and friends. I like to call them the 31 flavors of jihad. It's really, it's awful. I mean, it is, the worst possible thing. The Washington Post ran a story a couple of years ago, from Obama administration sources at the time, that they were funding them in Syria alone, the CIA, to a tune of $1 billion taxpayer dollars a year. And that's, of course, only part of what Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the UAE and Kuwait and Turkey and the UK were also spending, all in an attempt to get rid of a, authoritarian, corrupt, but still secular government in Syria that was a bulwark, against jihadists in the region. That just a few years earlier, I mean, and then this isn't, this is fact established in the mainstream media by the New York Times, the Washington Post. The US and the UK used to take rendition subjects to Syria to torture them there. So there's no question that the Syrian government tortured some people, right?
Yeah.
Because we brought jihadists there to torture them. And then, of course, it simply became convenient under this pretext of this Arab Spring to exacerbate the tensions there, to direct them, to arm them, to get rid of a government that was problematic because it still had close ties with Iran. It still had close ties with Russia. It was an obstacle to designs for pipelines running gas from Qatar to Europe that was on the intentions there. And you know, Obama went with this, and they funded the very, very worst type of people. I mean, this is the exact same type of stuff that Carter and Brzezinski did in Afghanistan to train the Mujahideen, which is literally the jihadists, right?
Yeah.
That's what that word means, to overthrow a socialist government in Afghanistan that brought in the Soviet intervention. Then, you know, and Brzezinski referred to it as an attempt to lure the Soviet Union into their own Vietnam. And that led to the birth of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. I mean, you know, once the Mujahideen polished the government there off in the 90s. You know, this is a policy of supporting the worst type of extremists cynically to achieve what some people see as U.S. I can't even call it national security goals, because it's not really about national security, of course.
No.
It doesn't affect U.S. national security in Oklahoma, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, whether Bashar al-Assad is the president of Syria or not. This is always about global military hegemony, right? This is not, the U.S. has interests, right? The U.S. has interests everywhere in the world. I mean, there are 1,000+ U.S. military bases scattered around the world. That is the literal construction of empire. I mean, it doesn't have to be direct, a suzerainty control of a territory. That's the way the British Empire started off, is with this archipelago of military bases, across the world, the empire that the sun never set on. And you know, that's where the U.S. is today. And its tripod for hegemony in the Middle East is the U.S. relations with Saudi Arabia on one hand and Israel on the other. And Saudi Arabia, for the Sunni Shia divide, is enemies with Iran. Iran is enemies with Israel over Palestine, and the U.S. over the U.S.-backed coup to put the Shah in, decades ago. And Syria is an ally of Iran, therefore Syria must go. And that's the horrible geopolitical logic there. But if we had to support head choppers and suicide bombers to get it done, then we always imagine we can stick some Chalabi liberal types on the top of this mess and come up with a functioning U.S. allied, quote, democracy, unquote.
Right.
Well, it didn't work in Iraq. It didn't work in Afghanistan. It didn't work in Libya. It didn't work in Syria. And it's not going to work in Yemen.
And it's really interesting. You hear the same keywords: democracy, national security. You hear these keywords, and that's when you know that they're invoking U.S. regime change. That's exactly what they want to do. Because if we had ever cared about spreading humanitarian aid or helping other people, there are very people in the United States and in other countries that we could have helped, like the Palestinians. But the U.S. never cares to help anybody unless there's a sort of interest in there. And it is very clear that now in the United States, we have people like Elizabeth Warren that are often propped as being progressives when actually they have very, very pro-war, pro-hawkish agendas for the military-industrial complex. I mean, she gets money from Raytheon. And they're propped up as being progressive. And people like Tulsi Gabbard, who are actually attacking the military-industrial complex, who are speaking out against regime change wars, are now Russian assets and vilified. And if it doesn't get any more clear as an outsider to you, that here right now we are not only fighting this election with the sort of economic issues that we have, but we are having a very either pro-war and pro-peace type of election. That's one of the reasons why so many people also voted for Donald Trump as well.
Yeah. And my question to add to all that is that, are you telling me that they lied to us in Rambo 3? Those weren't moderate rebels? I mean, wait, Mark, come on now. I mean, we talk about Hollywood being the arm of the military-industrial complex. That's a good example right there. I mean, the Mujahideen and what it is today. You put up another tweet. I'm sorry, did you want to?
The 80s, right? And Call of Duty whatever the current iteration is
Oh, yeah.
today, where you're helping the white helmets
Exactly.
battle the evil Russians in a Syria clone. I mean, it doesn't stop, does it?
No, not at all. We even thought a character in Fortnite, her name was Double Cross, could have been like Tulsi Gabbard. Like she had a Hawaiian dress on and a patch. People say I'm crazy, but I was like, wait a second. Her name is Double Cross, and she looks like Tulsi a little bit. So, I mean, they're doing some deep planting. You retweeted Dan Cohen, and you like to retweet Dan Cohen a lot. He's awesome. And it says it wasn't long ago. What's that?
He is. He's definitely awesome.
He's amazing. He's one of my favorites, too, as well. You put, it wasn't long ago that Turkey's jihadists, shock troops slaughtering Kurds in Syria, were promoted by U.S. politicians and media hacks as cuddly, moderate rebels, like the ones in Rambo 3. I hold some of them accountable in my latest video that he put up. Now, in Western media, the mainstream media has been exploiting the Kurds just to attack Donald Trump. And I don't want to start demonizing anybody whatsoever, but I've watched a lot of your shows. I've read a lot of the stuff, that's going on when it comes to the Kurds. Can you give us an overall analogy of the plight of the Kurds and how we got here today?
Yeah. So the Kurds are the largest ethnic group in the world that doesn't have a state, a nation state that is a Kurdish nation state. Now, that might tend a lot of people to support the idea of Kurdish independence and so on. Personally, I'm not a big advocate of the ideology of ethnic nationalism. The idea that a political state's borders should be completely congruous with a majority of one ethnic population. Right? This is an ideology that emerged in Europe, and the creation of a France where French people live in France and a Germany where German people live in Germany and so on. That happened after hundreds of years of fratricidal and genocidal warfare and ethnic cleansing that started with the wars of Spanish succession and still aren't over. They still happened recently in Yugoslavia and in Ukraine today. There's still basic conflicts over national identity and the formations of nations. So I have sympathy for particularly the Kurds in Turkey and Syria because they're of a leftist bent. But it's important to remember that the Kurds are not one unified monolithic people. They're spread largely between four states: Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. And they have different politics and different leaders in every one of those four countries. So even the idea of trying to chip away a piece of each one of those countries to form some type of Kurdish state, which none of those countries will allow. And at least two of them are U.S. allies, at least on paper.
Yeah.
Turkey, a NATO member, and Iraq with still a U.S. vaguely supported government there, after the overthrow of Saddam. They are never going to agree to an independent Kurdish state in the area. They're never going to even agree to an autonomous Kurdish region in one of the countries because of the inspiration and knock-on effect that would have among their own Kurdish minority. And then once that goes, if you give the Kurds a state, do the Druze get a state then? Do the Alawites get a state? Where does that stop? And you can't force Middle Eastern countries that are already suffering from these post-British Empire and Ottoman Empire colonial boundaries to then try to fit into a nation-state mold, because the wars would never stop, not in our lifetimes. And in a lot of ways, this ethnic and religious divides, are fueling the conflicts in Syria and elsewhere today. So the Kurds end up on kind of the short end of that stick. They definitely have been repressed in Turkey for a long time. It's important to note that not all of the Kurds in Turkey are Syria, politically are supported or support the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or its Syrian antecedent, the Kurdish People's Protection Units, the YPG. But they do represent a large, I would say, plurality, if not a majority, of the Kurdish people in those two countries. And when the regime change war, I'm sorry to use Tulsi Gabbard's Russian propaganda term here, to overthrow the Syrian government started, and the Syrian government had to contract and was under assault, and the jihadist forces started taking over the east, and they concentrated around the core coastal cities to protect them. They told the Kurds, we can't protect you, provide you with some arms and some money, but we don't have the manpower. You're on your own. You have autonomy. Good luck. And the Kurds in Syria in that situation, they turned to the U.S. For help as the U.S. was starting to look to get involved in eastern Syria in the fight against ISIS. Now, but it's important to remember that while the Pentagon started backing the Kurds in the Obama administration, the CIA was backing the Free Syrian Army and these other Islamist groups that were also fighting the Kurds.
Yeah.
And we had a CIA-backed FSA Islamists, right, allied with Al-Qaeda, and they were actually allied with ISIS too before they were against them. If you remember back to 2013, when the U.S.-backed Free Syrian Army was signing treaties of alliance with ISIS to take East Aleppo. That's not something anyone wants to talk about today. But CIA-backed Islamists versus Pentagon-backed Kurds, and that tells you something about the coherency of the Obama administration's policy for whatever it was trying to do in Syria. Make things a mess and hope Assad goes away. It was incoherent. It was badly thought through. It estranged the U.S. from allies in Turkey and Iraq, and it devastated Syria and resulted in the U.S. owns a high degree of responsibility, not just Assad, for hundreds of thousands of deaths in Syria. And the Kurds, they particularly when Trump came into office, and I don't like the man personally or his economics or anything else, but he largely ended, as much as he knew, CIA support for the Islamists and doubled down on the Pentagon support for the Kurds and made the Kurds into the proxy force for what became the U.S. then direct military occupation of East Syria. And the Kurds went with it. I mean, they saw a long shot chance for autonomy, and there evidently were some U.S. officials even promising them pie in the sky things like independence or a perpetual U.S. protectorate in East Syria. That was never on the table. And those U.S. officials who made those types of promises to, like James Jeffrey, to the Kurds, there's a special place in hell reserved for them. And I hope there's some Kurds there waiting for them when they get there. But the Kurds' only ever real hope from the Islamists now, and all of these former groups that used to be backed by the U.S. and Saudi Arabia and Qatar, Russia has kind of edged them out of the conflict one by one. So now there's a three-way Mexican standoff. The only one supporting the jihadists now, though it supports a lot of them, is Turkey.
Yeah.
And Turkey has, in Idlib, there's the control of Al-Qaeda, now rebranded as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, along with their allies, the Turkestan Islamic Party, not even Syrians, and Haras al-Din, which is like Al-Qaeda on steroids. And they still control Idlib with Turkish support, with Turkish occupation called observation posts, with convoys from Turkey every day carrying arms and gasoline and food and so forth. And they control Idlib. Turkey then controls a whole stretch of Syrian territory along the north central from the former Kurdish canton of Afrin through the important mountain pass from Turkey to Syria, the Jarablus corridor. And Turkey's been occupying this for 3 years now, and they're not leaving. And they want to drive out all the Kurdish people from this area. North Syria is where most of the Syrian Kurds live, and repopulate it with a lot of the 3.6 million Syrian refugees in Turkey. Yeah. A lot of them are these Islamist fighters and their families and people sympathetic to them and Turkmen, and ethnically cleanse northern Syria, getting rid of a security threat as they see it, and repopulating it with a protectorate that has leverage over Damascus and is loyal to Turkey, which created and supports it. And the Kurds are caught in this today. And Max Blumenthal did an excellent report at the Gray Zone Project that 21 out of 28 of these original groups now supported by Turkey as their, quote, Syrian National Army, as they're now calling them, used to be backed by the U.S. And now there's all this outcry from U.S. politicians about all the horrible, and they are horrible crimes they're committing against the Kurdish people in eastern Syria. The Turks and their jihadi proxies basically invading the U.S. invasion of eastern Syria. And they're all crying, and it is terrible. I don't want to see the Kurdish civilian population of East Syria suffer. But they were doing the same thing all across Syria for, the last 7-8 years, and there was no outcry when that was happening. So it's all really a bit hypocritical, yeah. And it's amazing the moral hoops that you have to jump through, moral logical hoops to continue to support this spinning position of hegemony as the dice fall. But the Kurds' only real hope is for a reconciliation with a Syrian government out of Damascus.
Absolutely.
That at least afforded them some degree, a fairly high degree as far as the Middle East is concerned, of political representation, ethnic and religious rights, and they can bargain for more now. Throughout the course of this conflict, the Kurds, the YPG, the Syrian Democratic Forces, whatever you want to call them, they refused repeated U.S. entreaties to turn on the Syrian government because they didn't see them as enemies. And the Syrian government never seriously fought them. So there's a lot of hope for reconciliation there. And that's the role Russia is trying to play, is contain Turkey's land grab in Syria, while at the same time bringing the Kurds and the Syrian government back together to rebuild their country. And the U.S. still is trying to play the spoiler. They can't get regime change by their proxy war. So economic blackmail by sitting on the oil, denying it for the reconstruction and rebuilding of the country.
You're jumping ahead to our next topic over there. I got a good tweet from Mark Sleboda I'm trying to play over here about the Russians. Go ahead, fam. I'm so sorry.
The Donald Trump?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you were kind of jumping on there. So Donald Trump is just being like a straight up gangster, as Pasta would say, because he's going after, Syria's oil. So let's take a quick peek. Pasta, you want to go ahead and read the...
Yeah, there's a Twitter we have over here, but it's pretty much the... you put up the video. Mm-hmm. I call it a Twitter. It's a tweet. My fam's got to correct me all the time. It says, Trump's plunder doctrine in action. They can pipe it or make use of it, but can sit on it to play destabilizing spoiler, prevent Syria from recovering economically and rebuilding, and try to force regime change via economic blackmail now. And I just want to take a little quick peek at what Donald Trump said, because, God bless the man for at least being completely open, honest on what, you know what I'm saying? God, for at least no politician of America would say this except for Donald Trump. Yeah, we're taking the oil.
We've secured the oil, and therefore a small number of U.S. troops will remain in the area where they have the oil. And we're going to be protecting it, and we'll be deciding what we're going to do with it in the future. In any event, by the moves that we've made, we're achieving a much more peaceful and stable area.
I mean, Mark, WTF? I mean, what are they going to do? They're going to make it part of Jordan now, or are they going to make it part of Iraq? I mean, tell me what they're going to do with this here, because this is just hysterical.
Yeah, I want to give Trump credit to the man that, he's predictable on this. And I said at the time that I expected some neocon genius to play the oil card with Trump and get him to keep troops in Syria. And sure enough, it was Lindsey Graham, at least according to the Washington Post, that did the arguing. And Lindsey, hey, you're good at what you do. And he manipulated Trump's febrile and mercurial little mind with the thing that he's always been obsessed with. And, give Trump credit for honesty that U.S. presidents have never had in their real aims, whether it's in Iraq or in Libya or so on. I mean, it's never solely about oil, but that's always part of the foreign policy,
Right.
Calculation of why we're going in there, for control of oil flows. And, that's exactly what's happening here. But how now the Russians and the Syrian government have been brought by the Kurds that are currently trying to sleep in two beds again, across the Euphrates into eastern Syria, all along the border, starting to come down along the border with Iraq. True. These oil fields are in the middle of southeast Syria in Deir ez-Zor, a desert province, populated by Arab tribes. And it's far away from Iraq or Jordan. And how the U.S. is going to maintain a few hundred troops out there to keep control of this oil, keep them supplied, keep them repurposed. Are they going to conduct a continual air resupply out of Iraqi Kurdistan? Because the Turks certainly aren't going to help them now. I don't know how they think this is actually going to work. Are they going to be forced to seize territory going all the way to Iraq and take over part of the Iraqi-Syrian border too? Is that what it will come to? Whatever. This is a recipe for more creeping escalation, right?
Yeah.
They fed Donald Trump on this, right? A minimal force and everything, but that will never work. And once he's bought into this, he's going to have to build into more to keep it resupplied, to keep it stable. And again, a big part of the calculation, deny the oil to the Syrian government, but also there's this fantasy that simply by sitting in East Syria, it somehow interrupts Iranian supplies and influence through Iraq, which became allied with Iran after the U.S. overthrew Saddam Hussein. Thank you very much. You give a Shia majority democracy, and they're going to ally themselves with the Shia country next door.
Absolutely.
U.S. created that geopolitical backlash all on their own. Lebanon, Syria, which is now more closely allied with Iran than they ever were before, since Iran helped come to their aid during this conflict, and with Hezbollah in Syria. But simply by sitting in the middle of the Syrian desert or even an Al-Tanf base in the south, that's not helping stop Iranian influence. It's actually encouraging it. It's amazing thinking. But part of the real calculation here is to keep Syria continually destabilized and weak. And if Syria is destabilized and weak, which of course gives always a power vacuum for ISIS and Al-Qaeda and others to grow, that provides further justification for the U.S. to be in the area, to fight the terrorists that their presence there is helping create because of the power vacuum that they're making. And it deprives Iran of a solid Syria as an ally. A destabilized Syria is a Syria that isn't aiding Hezbollah as much or isn't as focused on that. And Lebanon's got its own political problems right now.
Yeah. The Russians, because you kind of alluded to that, the Russians have kind of said they're going to stand up for Syria. They have vowed that they were going to stand up. Do you see this conflict with Syria rising up? Because obviously now we're seeing the alliances, Syria and Russia, and then obviously now this can escalate into something bigger.
Yeah, I mean, that's always been the potential all along. And Russia has actually thought this through very carefully when they decided to intervene in Syria in 2015. And they've played a complicated geopolitical dance that sees Putin, basically, I like to see it as waltzing across a chessboard with Erdogan, with both of them with daggers raised against each other's back, waiting to plunge it in. And that's the reality of the situation, where Russia's able to have good economic and other political relations with Turkey outside of Syria and manage their relationship. But they're actually technically at war in Syria itself. And they're managing that conflict. Russia, in a hope to give Turkey, Erdogan, the saving face that he needs, and the time to realize that his position is untenable there, to withdraw, while containing the Americans at the same time, and that's now proving more difficult. But a lot of people don't realize this. Russia has had a mutual defense pact with Syria for decades now. I mean, there has been a Soviet, then a Russian military base, a naval base, wasn't much until a few years ago, in Tartus for a long time. And Russia was always going to see the overthrow of at least tepidly allied Syria, to jihadi forces. That there were some 3,000 at least Russian and former Soviet citizens fighting on the side of the jihadists, right?
Yeah.
Wahhabists of Chechen, Ingus, Dagestani, and other origins in Russia that came to Syria to form some form of the Islamic Caliphate or Emirate, and if they won in Syria, you could bet they would be back in southern Russia. Syria, the northeastern tip of Syria, is only 24 hours by jeep to southern Russia. That's Russia's part of the world, and the potential jihadi terrorism, coming back up into Russia that way from a Saudi Turkish proxy state in Syria was just something that Russia, for real legitimate national security reasons, the security of their own country, could never allow. And when they see that Damascus could actually fall to ISIS or Al-Qaeda or Har al-Sham or some combination of the three, some type of splintering of Syria, that's when they went in 2015. And that's exactly when Obama and Erdogan were both planning, Erdogan at that time pushing Obama towards it, the idea of a safe zone across northern Syria that would be a duplicate of what was pulled off in Libya, where you declare Benghazi a safe zone and then expand that until you then eventually move against the capital. And Russia saw that was what was on the books, and they went in and they stopped it. And everything since has been to get one player after another to quit the conflict. And now it's just down to the U.S. and Turkey.
Wow, that's good. I mean, it's crazy when you think about Syria, like
Yeah.
Obama, how bad he was on foreign policy. We say it all the time. We're not trying to trash on the ex-president, but I mean, like you said, one side is for the Pentagon's, funding the Kurds, while the CIA is funding the jihadists, and the military-industrial complex is funding all sides, making a ton of money. And the fact that he allowed this to happen, Timber Sycamore, talk about it all the time.
Yeah, Sycamore.
It's crazy.
Pam, specifically, you asked about direct conflict, the potential of blowing up.
Yeah.
Russia's been very careful, doing everything possible to avoid direct conflict with Turkey or the U.S.
Yeah.
But now they are, all three of them, in the same space, including the Syrian government and Iran, and 80,000 jihadis under Turkish proxy arms now in the Syrian National Army. There's 80,000 of them. And the Kurds, and they're all in this tight, explosive space still in northeast Syria. And everyone is trying to prevent a direct conflict between Russia and Turkey and the U.S., or any combination of the three in this Mexican standoff there. But this is exactly where mistakes and misunderstandings and so on can happen and escalate. Russia's trying to avoid it. I don't think the U.S. wants war with Russia in Syria either. But anything could happen. The potential for catastrophe still exists and is possibly even higher than ever.
Wow. You got a super chat?
We're going to do some super chats and get on to the next topic, Ukraine. That was awesome. There's so much stuff I learned. I can't wait to go back and watch not only myself with Mark Sleboda on the CONVO couch, but everything we talked about, man. It's great. And we're going to get on to Ukraine, which is even better because Ukraine is even more misunderstood by Westerners than Syria. I mean, they have no idea what's going on about Ukraine. But let me read some super chats real quick. I want to say thank you to A. Mars for the super chat contribution, and it's always appreciated on the couch. How about that 9/11 Tulsi conference today? Yes, we will be talking about that tomorrow. Also, a super chat contribution from A-Mars again, or A-Mars. Fee. Even the Girl Scouts get money from Raytheon. Did you see that? There was a Raytheon Girl Scout cookie commercial.
Yeah.
I shit you not.
It's crazy. Like, now we're indoctrinating young girls to, like.
Why not? Why not? I mean, I wouldn't have believed it. Sounds like an onion piece, but yeah, I believe it.
I know. All the onion pieces are like coming for reals, for reals. They're turning for reals. Now, before we would move to Ukraine, I'd just like to let you know, Mark, in your honor, my reporting style, what I like to do, and I think I find it very helpful, you're a guy who likes to give out nicknames. In fact, I call John Bolton the Walrus because you do. And when I started talking about the Ukraine, I labeled Poroshenko, Pork Chop Poroshenko, to understand who this Ukrainian oligarch is. But you have a great tweet out there with a little video, and this is just amazing. When I showed this to Johnny, our engineer over here, take a look at this, and this is what's going on in the Ukraine. This is a little video because people have no clue what's going on, and it says, hashtag Ukraine's president argues with neo-Nazi soldiers who took military weapons into a village. He says, leave the village and turn in the arms. They refuse him, BS him, and endless arguing. Then the chief of police overrules Zelensky, the president, death threats, etc. They say they will bring more weapons and fighters. Can you tell us what's going on, Mark? Your mic is on because there's no subtitles.
Yeah. Okay, so this is Zelensky, the new comedian, voted in as president of Jewish descent of Ukraine, and they kind of throw out all the crooks and bring in some people who have never been involved in politics before. Calculation by the suffering Ukrainian people. He wants to restore the standard of living of Ukrainians. They're now the poorest country in Europe, poorer than even Moldova. That's how far they've fallen over the last 5 years. But you can't restore Ukraine's economy without repairing relations with Russia, right? Because Russia is still, even after 5 years in this EU association agreement, their biggest state trading partner. And you're never going to have an economically successful Ukraine without restored economic relations with Russia. That's simple, geopolitical reality. And of course, you've still got the eastern part of Ukraine that has never accepted the U.S.-backed overthrow of the government elected by East Ukrainians in 2014. And they control what was the former industrial heartland, the Donbass, also where the coal reserves are, which are used to provide electricity for the country. They still burn coal in Ukraine. And he needs peace in eastern Ukraine, peace with his own countrymen that are still being killed on both sides every day. You'll hear all this stuff about Russian invasion of Donbass. It's all nonsense. Russia has provided the same amount of advisors and trainers to the people in Donbass that the U.S. And NATO did to the government, the regime that they helped seize power in 2014. And that's it, right? That's the extent of it. Russia's there to the same extent the U.S. and NATO are in the rest of Ukraine. It's now a proxy war with Ukrainians who are divided on the idea of what it means to be a Ukrainian in terms of national identity, language, and culture. And again, this is another conflict where the U.S., to overthrow the government there, backed extremists. And in this case, these are largely West Ukrainians who adhere to what is Banderite fascism, which is Ukraine's homegrown fascism that collaborated with Hitler in World War II and was eventually crushed over the course of the conflict. The U.S. continued to support them throughout the early years of the Cold War in the 50s. They were then known as the Forrest Brothers and so on. The U.S., Dulles at the time said they're fascists, but they're our fascists. And it jumped forward, right, until 2014, and the U.S. is back supporting fascists today. Now, is that everyone in Ukraine a fascist? No, right? And to suggest that Russia is saying that is actually a piece of U.S. propaganda. They are a minority, right? They are a minority nationally. They refer to themselves, they don't even have those numbers, but they refer to themselves as the patriotic, the activist 25%. And they think that they should rule over the rest of Ukraine, right? Because they are the ones who really care about Ukraine, at least their conception of Ukrainian national identity, which again is still tied into all of these Ukrainian West Ukrainian World War II fascist leaders. Zelensky, the new president, he's no friend of Russia, but he wants to restore some basic standard of living, end the war in his own country, and restart some economic relations. To do that, he needs to adhere to the Minsk protocols that were agreed upon by the Ukraine and Germany and France and other countries, but have never been enacted. And the most basic first step of those is the withdrawal of troops from the conflict line. Which is there's still a frozen conflict, artillery and mortar fire every day back and forth, and a slow trickle of lives and damage to houses.
Still today.
So
today.
Yeah, still.
Yeah.
In the last few days, actually. Yeah. And these patriotic battalions, these literal neo-Nazis, and Azov is a neo-Nazi organization with incredible reach. Right? They formed on the Maidan. They were the Nascent battalions. They helped storm the government in Kiev. They then solidified, gained political influence. Part of them is inside the official Ukrainian National Guard now, the Azov regiment of the National Guard. And they're all them and a whole bunch of other groups, C-14, named after the white supremacist 14 words. The C is Slov, which is Russian for word, the 14 words. And all of these other battalions, there's a whole lot of them. They are literally neo-Nazis, right? And it's not, they were the vanguard of the overthrow of the government. They're not a majority of Ukrainians. They're not every politician in the Ukrainian government, the previous one or the current one, but they're there. And they drive the country to an outsized extent because they are the politically passionate, and they're willing to mix it up and fight to get what they want and what they want Ukraine to be. Mm-hmm. And they are resisting Zelensky's capitulation to the Russians, fulfilling the Minsk protocols. They refuse to leave these villages on the border lines. They say, even if you pull out the Ukrainian military, we will come in and sit here in the thousands because we will not let you surrender to Russia.
Wait, are you telling me for a second that you said that Barack Obama supported and funded jihadists in Syria and now neo-Nazis in the Ukraine? Come on,
yes,
Mark.
That's not a conspiracy theory. That is a point of fact. That is a point of indisputable fact. Right? And to suggest that it's not true, that is the actual propaganda. And full disclosure here, my wife is Crimean, right? I definitely have a vested interest, but it also gives me knowledge. We have family in the Crimea, in Simferopol. My in-laws live there. We've also got extended family in the Donbass, in Kharkov, in Odessa. I know Ukraine pretty well. And I know about the problems, the identity divide that has long in that country, and knew that they had always had to balance their politics since independence between a Western or nationalist-leaning West Ukraine and a Russian-leaning East Ukraine. And this was forced. Russia went to the EU. This was all supposedly done over this EU association agreement. And said, we already have a free trade agreement with Ukraine. Why don't we sit down, the three of us together, and work out a deal that we can all benefit and trade with each other? And the EU, backed by the US at the time, said no. Ukraine needs to make a civilizational choice. That's the terms the EU officials used. Right? A civilizational choice.
Yeah.
Well, forcing Ukraine to make a civilizational choice resulted in a civil war in Ukraine. Thanks a lot.
And a lot of these people involved, which many of the the Americans don't know here, were Adam Schiff, Nancy Pelosi, Joe Biden's children, Nancy's children, and several of the oligarchs.
Alexandra Chalupa.
And well, they had ties to Igor Pasternak. But are there any other people? Because so far, all you hear in the liberal media is that this is all Donald Trump's fault. Here's the thing: don't make me defend Donald Trump, right? But the liberal media has this capacity to make him look better. That's all they've been doing.
Yeah, I mean, when the Democrats have made themselves the war party, when Robert Kagan and the other neocons flocked to Hillary Clinton's banner, you, without liking Trump, find yourself, at least on the 2 times a day that the broken clock is right, you find yourself forced into a half-hearted apology for him. But that's the truth of the situation. And Trump inherited this mess from Obama. And yeah, Trump doesn't like Ukraine because the Ukrainian leaders that the U.S. installed at the time, they were openly campaigning and aiding the Clinton campaign against him. Yeah, they don't like him very much because, simple, the one consistent foreign policy platform he had during his campaign was restoring relations with Russia. And that would leave the new U.S.-backed regime in Kiev in a bad place. So they did everything possible that they thought they could do to help make sure Donald Trump wasn't elected. And when he is, lo and behold, he doesn't like them very much. Just like he doesn't like the leaders in Western European countries who also made clear their preference for Clinton. Some of their state media's basically endorsing her and activating her. And that led to, the downslide in relations between the U.S. and its, traditional Western European allies today, because the Europeans meddled in American politics. And the Europeans don't think that's unusual because of the nature of the EU now. They all endorse each other in each other's elections, the liberals and across or against the conservatives across and so on. But they think that they can endorse and take positions about U.S. political elections too. And as someone who moved to Russia, watching that the Europeans and of course the Israelis and the Saudis and the Ukrainians all actually meddled in the U.S. elections more than Russia did.
Yeah,
it all looks like kind of a feces show from over here.
I don't think a lot of people understand too, Mark, especially in the West, that was like a televised U.S.-backed coup. George Soros had his dirty fingers in there. I mean, there was a bunch of NGOs and what's that?
Omidyar, who backs The Intercept, and unfortunately, Glenn Greenwald, he was instrumental funding these groups. The U.S. State Department and the Dutch State Department openly admit proudly on their pages to starting up and funding Hromadske, which was the principal propaganda and organizing outfit, which the Ukrainian, the Maidan activists themselves admit that the Maidan wouldn't have happened without Hromadske. The U.S. literally funded it, brought in the startup equipment, right? And that was in December of 2013. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. And the U.S. was intimately involved in the overthrow of the government there. Yeah. And that involved some liberals, some nationalists, and a vanguard of Banderite fascists, this unholy union to get rid of what was seen as a Russian-backed government there. It wasn't.
Yeah.
It was a government that simply didn't rabidly hate Russia and would work with them. That is the new standard for what is, Russian-backed. If you don't actively hate Russia and seek to align geopolitically with NATO and a Western alliance, then you are a Russian apologist or a Russian puppet or Russian-backed and so on. And a lot of people don't realize that Yanukovych was pushing the EU association agreement up until he saw the final terms and realized it was a neoliberal shock therapy diktat, and he wasn't even being offered any money to ameliorate the effects of unemploying millions of people and so on, and then said, no, not under those terms. And then suddenly he was an enemy that needed to be gone. And it's referred to as a popular revolution, right? Oh, a revolution of dignity, because only these Ukrainians have dignity. But do they ever talk about the polls, right? Printed in the U.S., then at the time owned and run Kiev Post, very supportive of the Maidan U.S. positions, polls that shows that actually the country was completely divided. Over a course of a couple months, repeated polls, 51% against the Maidan, 48 for. 48 for, 45, or 48 against, 45 for. So, yeah, roughly about half the country, slightly more against. But that's the reality. And that's why there is a civil conflict in Ukraine today. And it is a civil conflict. It's not a Russian invasion. It's U.S.-backed Ukrainians killing Russian-backed Ukrainians in Ukraine. And that's the story.
Wow.
It seems like they almost like if you watch, and if you go to Mark Sleboda's Twitter, you can see a lot of stuff from Dan Cohen and other people. It almost looks like the protesters in Hong Kong are mimicking some of the protesters in Kiev that one time. It's like they're armed to the teeth, helmets.
In Hong Kong, they showed these Ukrainian revolution propaganda videos, Winter on Fire. They showed them in public theaters in Hong Kong. And it's this exact same marginal violence theory that was talked about openly by Hong Kong protest advocates in the New York Times. You can read all about it. Marginal violence theory, that you push the government as hard as they can to take violent steps, and you make it impossible for them. You interrupt the normal flow of society until they have to take violent steps against you. And if they still don't take violence against you, well, then it's okay to use a little bit of violence to incite them to more violence. And that's actually what they claim. And that's what happened even worse on the Maidan, and that is what is happening in Hong Kong today.
It's almost like Xi Jinping is like in the same position that Putin was in Ukraine, and he's sitting there in China going, man, do I go in there? Do I stop this? But once I do, the West is going to say, look at them. Look what they're doing. And now you got more aircraft carriers.
They're crushing democracy.
And,
they're crushing democracy. That's what they're going to say.
Democracy. The U.S. is allied with Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Bahrain. 3 absolute repressive medieval Wahhabist dictatorships with U.S. military bases, hundreds of billions of dollars of arms. I will not accept moralizing statements about freedom and democracy from a government that has those as its allies for control of the Middle East and thus the world. No, I do not accept those arguments, and neither should any of you. You can accept them from realist, hegemonic national interest perspective if you want, but don't moralize, because it really looks bad on you.
Absolutely. 100%. You want to go over that?
No, I was just going to say, and it was just we're going to transition to the next topic, but just awesome. And I think we should, what I do, Mark, and I encourage my audience to do this, is I'm going back and watching crosstalks from 4 or 5 years ago and some of the guests. I mean, it is amazing. And I don't even watch them in order. Sometimes I go 5 years, 4 years. I mean, it's just so intriguing, and the work you guys did on that, and yourself, you were amazing. So I'm sure you'll be sharing a lot of my tweets where I clip you up, because it's just some beautiful, juicy information. And when I get to argue with these California neoliberals, these establishment hacks on foreign policies, I get to eat them up, and I'm like, thanks, Mark Sleboda. Let's transition to Lebanon and Iraq, because, and I'm really glad you retweeted this, because I was always kind of questioning Moon over Alabama. Every single time I saw it, I was like, man, is this a credible source? Because people would, I would put something up. I remember putting something up about the Houthis showing off their drones on Moon over Alabama, and people were like, oh, that's a bullshit source. That's just terrible. And then a week later, they hit the oil refinery. So in this Moon over Alabama article that you put up, it says why Lebanon and Iraq are at the brink of a further strife. Today, the Prime Minister of Lebanon, Saad Harari, resigned after, at times, violent protest. In Iraq, the Gladfi cleric, and I hope I say this right, Muqtada Sadar, joined protesters after previous protests in Iraq had also led to violence. In both countries, at least some of the protesters demanded the resignation of their governments. While the demonstrations in both countries are about local economic and political issues, there are foreign actors involved who want them to use them to achieve their own goal. It seems like, what episode is this? I said Rambo 3. Is this Arab Spring 5 or Arab Spring 6? You know, is George Soros going to make a little appearance in this one?
Yeah, I mean, both of these countries have their economic and even more their sectarian divides and political problems. In both countries, their politics is still defined by their ethnicity and their religion, which is why democracy is a really bad match with these countries, because it creates permanent resentful minorities that are ruled over by ethnic and religious majorities. And to take a winner-take-all, European-style democratic system and try to put it with these countries is a mixture for exposure and disaster. And the U.S. is, of course, exacerbating and try to take advantage of this discontent in both countries in the way it always does. And you're a former military man. I think you know what is in the U.S.'s own unconventional warfare manual, right? I mean, we would call it hybrid warfare today, going back decades to exploit ethnic and religious divisions in other countries for U.S. policy goals. And they always try to get on top of these things, and they are instrumentally involved there. And what is happening in both countries, again, is part of a geopolitical proxy war between Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the U.S. on one side, and Iran on the other. And that's at the heart of the political nature that these economic protests and anti-corruption protests in both Iraq and Lebanon are being driven to. They start one way, but they're being directed another way. And that's exactly what's happening in both countries. They've both got really messed up ethnic sectarian politics, and you're just going in and you're exciting this and exacerbating those differences, which is putting a teapot on the stove and cranking the heat right up. When I saw David Ignatius in the Washington Post a couple of weeks ago with an article that started off, the title was "Syria is lost, but we can save Lebanon." I'm like, oh no. I'm like,
next Lebanon is lost, but we can save. What's next? Cuba? Haiti?
Yeah.
Sorry. Anyways, I also just wanted to mention that you also like to tweet Sarah Abdallah. I think she's awesome. She put a tweet up, and it says it was the whole, and once again, how we don't pay attention to this, the whole deep state, the Mike Pompeo one, and she says, "Stay the hell away from us. Lebanon does not need lessons from an admitted liar, thief, and cheater." What is the CIA going to be doing in Lebanon right now? Are they going to be doing more of the same? Do they have a group they're going to back? Do you know any lines of what's going to happen in Lebanon?
Yeah. So, the CIA in Lebanon is backing, of course, the Saudi position, which is more or less to back the Sunnis, right? One of the ethnic, divided portions of a very fragile Lebanese state. Lebanon's politics are actually constitutionally divided, that the different groups of Christians, the Sunnis, the Shias, the Druze, the others, they all get a guaranteed number of seats in their parliament by the religion. It's a really fragile balance there. And then there's some political parties laid over that ethnic and religious divide on top of that. It's a really explosive mix. And Hezbollah is one of the elected big political parties in Lebanese politics. And again, the U.S. loves democracy, except when it produces results like electing Hezbollah in Lebanon or Hamas in Palestine. Then they hate democracy, and it's not real democracy, of course, because we don't like the results. But by the a Lebanese prime minister was basically just forced to resign over the course of these protests. And yeah, there's corruption. There's a lot of economic problems. The protests actually started over an attempted by the government to put a tax WhatsApp and other messages.
Yeah.
It sounds crazy.
I know.
That spiraled into an explosion of general economic and corruption discontent. But if you'll remember, the prime minister of Lebanon was kidnapped a couple years ago by Saudi Arabia, where he also has citizenship somehow. The prime minister of Lebanon has 4 citizenships, and Lebanon's only one of them. And he was kidnapped and eventually allowed to go back. The Saudis wanted him to resign. He took back that message eventually. But now he is resigning. And that actually leaves Hezbollah as the biggest, Hezbollah and its alliance with Amal, as the biggest party to form a new government. And Hezbollah does not want to run the Lebanese government, because that will open itself up into all kinds of political problems with the West and the United States. It's much happier being a supporting actor behind the scene. So now there's a question, will there be general elections in Lebanon, so on. But once again, there was this fragile political balance in Lebanon, where Lebanon stayed neutral throughout all these years of the Syrian conflict and so on. And they're tossing a match in the powder keg, and now Lebanon's politics are about to explode. And I'm sorry, I automatically believe the CIA, and I know the Saudis are on the ground trying to drive these protests into an anti-Hezbollah direction. And Hezbollah right now has found itself wanting to support the government that it doesn't necessarily have great relationships with. It doesn't love. He's from pro-Western faction, but he's kept the balance in Lebanon. And Hezbollah doesn't want to see that political balance removed. And they don't want to be the leaders of the country, amazingly enough. And that's where they find themselves in the position. And it's the U.S. and Saudi trying to direct these protests away from an anti-neoliberal corruption angle and towards an anti-Hezbollah angle, because Hezbollah has found itself in the position they don't want to, of trying actually to defend that the government should stay on.
Yep.
So I just want to clarify for people that don't know, you're not saying that these protests aren't legitimately started for good reasons. However, they are manipulated by the certain interests once they're there, and they're being pushed a certain direction. Because, there's a lot of talk of these protests being against the neoliberal establishment. However, of course, the U.S. is always opportunist, and not just the U.S., but obviously Western interests are always there, seeking that opportunity to drive those protests for whatever benefits them, so to speak.
Exactly. That's always the case. And it was the case in Syria and Ukraine and Hong Kong and Libya and Egypt and everywhere else. That is always the case. Again, it's right out of the U.S. Unconventional Warfare Manual. You find those fault lines, those societal fault lines on politics and ethnicity and religion, and you drive a wedge in and support one faction or another to promote what is their perception of U.S. national security interests, hegemonic interests in those countries.
I think Nicaragua could be added to that list too as well. But
Venezuela, of course.
Yeah. But the thing that's really disappointing about this, Mark, though, is that you see in Lebanon, and just like in Egypt, because Egypt seems like was a young revolution that was hijacked from the Arab Spring. Like the Arab Spring seemed to come in there and hijack it from these young kids. And you see a person like Sarah Abdallah tweeting this stuff out there. I was hoping there was some way the young youth movement in Lebanon could keep itself, like Heisman Trophy itself, stiff arm the CIA and the funding and do its own thing and maybe obtain some power. Do you ever see something like that, like a movement happening within its own country like Lebanon without Western influence? Is that possible?
Not while the U.S. still dominates the world economy and still has the economic and political reach to extend into these countries and has a foreign policy of hegemony. They will always interfere. They can't bring themselves to not interfering. They believe in Pax Americana, that the world is a better place for America and for other countries for their interference. I mean, and Carnegie Mellon professors did their own study. The U.S. has meddled in more countries' elections to a degree. 81 sometimes, just between the end of the Cold War and 2000. And that's actually when they kicked up in hyperdrive. And that's not counting regime changes and invasions and airstrikes and so on, the overt. This is just the covert meddling and influence in other countries' elections. They can't not interfere. They're serial. They're addicted to it. And you can hear it in every one of these bipartisan statements supporting one military mission or U.S. influence, and Nancy Pelosi supporting, what is essentially a leverage of U.S. Trump's trade war against China through these Hong Kong protests, and then that's exactly what's going on there. Yeah. It's bipartisan. They can't not do it.
It's like the U.S. is with wars like me with Nutella. Can't help myself, man. Gotta have that. Do you get Nutella in Moscow or no?
I think I had Nutella in Moscow for the first time, actually.
Okay, because I would send you some if you couldn't get. I would trade you Nutella for a Russian hat.
So final thoughts, Mark. You tweet Tulsi.
Memphis barbecue. Send me some Memphis barbecue.
Oh. That's what you want?
That makes sense.
Memphis. You want the sauce or you want actual? Because I don't think actual Memphis barbecue.
Yeah, yes. I'll some sauce would work. Any Southern barbecue.
What if I make like a Southern barbecue sauce for you? I'll send you some.
I'll get
it. Yeah, I can do that. You like?
My mouth is watering.
I'll handle that for some Russian. Whatever you call those Kushkas hats. I don't even know, but
Shapka Ushanka.
What he said.
That. So, Mark, you tweet at Tulsi a lot. She's obviously the favored for progressive foreign policy
and
junkies.
Putin, Vladimir Putin, obviously.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that too. And Assad. But what? First of all, what do you think about her run right now? And also, what do you think is a fair criticism of her as far as her foreign policy goes?
Yeah, I mean, I think Tulsi, in a theoretical world, she is the best U.S. presidential candidate because the U.S. presidency is primarily about foreign policy and military matters. Ignore all the domestic noise. When you're electing a president, it should be about the U.S. presidential powers, constitutionally, foreign policy or military. She has a foreign policy and military position that I support far more than any others. And she really wants to end this pursuit of global hegemony. She's a fellow veteran like me, like you, Craig, right? And she sees what the U.S. is doing around the world. She's seen it. She wants to end it. That said, I don't agree with her on everything. There are lots of questions that some people have about her relationship with the Indian government and the BJP and Modi. They really try to, I think, exaggerate her connections there, and by handpicking a few people that donate money to her, the connections that they then have to people back in India. I don't have those particular problems myself. I don't worry about that. I don't have any problems stepping into the Pakistan India debate and taking sides and taking heads in that one. I don't have that particular problem with Tulsi. But I'm afraid that my endorsement of her may help really further the idea that both her and you are now Russian bots.
Yeah.
Too. But this is the demonization that's occurring in U.S. politics today. You criticize U.S. foreign policy, you're then helping Putin. I mean, that's the simple Neil McCarthyite logic of it. You can't criticize what the U.S. is doing in the world because that's what Putin wants, and that somehow is allowed to shut down arguments and debates on CNN and everywhere. Well, except when Tulsi's involved, because it's pretty much impossible to shut her down unless you turn off the cameras. Yeah,
and she. I mean, the way she attacked Hillary Clinton, I think a lot of people were waiting for somebody to say what everybody thought but didn't dare say. And people are afraid of the Clintons. They won't even mention them by name. And she had the audacity to do that. And I think that actually did something to her campaign, and it changed the course, I think, of how we're going to proceed now. Because now that people are realizing like that sort of honesty and transparency that is similar in Donald Trump, except he's not as, fluid with his language as she is something that people
she actually
value.
has principles. For him, it's
Right.
all cost benefit analysis and ignorance. She actually has principles. That
Her
makes
intent.
her far more dangerous to the deep state, to the blob, to the military industrial complex, whatever you want to call them. She, like Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, far, far more dangerous than Trump could ever dream of being.
Yeah, and it's funny to say that. I've heard several times that Trump is like the first president in 30 years not to start his own conflict whatsoever, and that's crazy.
Yeah.
But yet he's not a non-interventionist whatsoever. We talked about this on the show today. His sanction wars, and he stepped up to bombing in Afghanistan, and he still hasn't made a deal with them, nor will he ever, because Big Pharma's not going to let go of those opium fields, first of all. But I mean, the fact that he's been better than the liberals before him is just mind-blowing and crazy, and that's something that the Democrats today just cannot deal with. They go ape shit crazy when you start saying Donald Trump. They go nuts. So,
You know Stephen Walt?
no, I do not.
He's a professor of political science. He's a realist at Harvard, and he writes for Foreign Policy frequently. And he wrote a piece a few years ago about it was a questionnaire to determine if you're a liberal imperialist. And it talks about, the questionnaire and the commentary talks about how the neocons and the liberal imperialists are just flip sides of the same coin, one with just slightly
Yes, they
better
are.
PR and rhetoric than the other. I think it's a really a must read. Take that questionnaire yourself and see where you come down on the side of U.S. policy. It's Stephen Walt at Foreign Policy.
Nice.
Yeah, that's awesome.
I will.
Well, that looks like it's about it for us tonight. Did you have a good time here, Mark?
I think it's fabulous. I mean, I'm kind of wondering if you guys could like reserve some spare couch, and the couch looks really comfortable. Can I crash at your guys' place and come and sit on it myself someday?
Absolutely, yeah.
100%. And if you want us to reserve a spot, we like this time, this Tuesday night, for the political foreign policy junkies. We talked about it. I mean, there's a lot of stuff I want to talk to you about. Like, I got China next, and there's so much more stuff I'd love to talk to you. So if you'd like to do this again, I was reading the chat here and there, and you got a really good going over here. A lot of people really like and said they would like to see you more often. So, hey, the couch is open to you if you'd like.
Just reserve a cushion for me. Just reserve a
You
cushion.
got it.
We will reserve a cushion. Ladies and gentlemen, that was Mark
We've got a
Sleboda.
spare room here in Moscow. So
Oh, dude, we're coming now. That's it. You don't have to. I'm bringing
We are.
Nutella and Memphis barbecue sauce. That's what we're
Yeah,
doing.
Graham went. We'll have to go next.
We're going to Russia. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching today. That was Mark Sleboda. Hopefully, we'll have him on again. Thank you, Mark. Can you tell people where they can find you nowadays, other than their Twitter? I mean, you have somewhere else, or should they just go to their Twitter?
I'm on Twitter. I'm on Facebook, and I'm on a whole almost weekly on radio shows on Sputnik, Loud and Clear with Brian Becker, Lee and Stranahan on Fault Lines, By Any Means Necessary with Eugene Perrier, a great guy, and on the Critical Hour as well. And those are all great shows on foreign policy, and I'm on each one of those almost weekly.
That's awesome.
So,
Anything
well,
else?
no, just
Well, perfect. Well,
saying hello to Russia then.
that's right. From Russia with love, from Moscow, this was the Convo Couch. Don't forget, ladies and gentlemen, we have a Rockfin. We want you to go over there, ROKFIN. It is a crypto currency-based platform. We also have a Twitter, Twitch, YouTube, and Facebook for Pasta Jardula.
Fiorella Isabel, the Russian bot.
Jonny Tsunami.
Craig,
Russians
Pam,
out.
spasiba, до свидания.
God bless you too,
Pravda.
Mark Sleboda.